Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Lee McIntyre. He is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University. And today we're going to talk about his new book, How to Talk to a Science Denier, Conversations with Flat Earthers, Climate Deniers, and Others Who Defy Reason. So, Dr. McIntyre, welcome to the show again. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Me as well. Thank you for having me back.
Right. So, first of all, I guess I would start with the most basic question. So, what is a science denier?
That's an important question to ask at the beginning because science deniers do not identify as science deniers, and they get, of course, irritated by the title. And I've had some people say that, why do you call me a science denier when I just deny the scientific consensus, when I challenge the scientific consensus, because isn't that what scientists do? So let me clarify. A science denier is someone who not only challenges the scientific consensus, but someone who doesn't have good evidence for their own alternative theory to whatever the scientific consensus is, and also importantly, someone who's not willing to say what evidence would convince them to give up their own theory. That's the true mark of a science denier, somebody who won't say in advance, if you show me X, then my view must be wrong and I'll give it up.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, do they have specific psychological traits that make them different from the other people? I mean, the people who are not science deniers.
Well, I'm not a psychologist, so I can't speak to that. And it would be really interesting, I think, if I could ever find some literature where somebody put science deniers in an fMRI machine and figured this out. As far as I can tell, I don't think that there is a psychological profile of a science denier per se. Now, there are some psychological profiles of conspiracy theorists, and virtually all science deniers are conspiracy theorists. So that's about as close as we can get to it. I'll say that the common thread amongst science deniers, whether they're evolution deniers, climate deniers, flat earthers, COVID deniers, is that they follow the same strategy of reasoning. And this has been established. These are the 5 tropes of science denial reasoning. And I can say more about that. The folks who have studied the psychological profile of conspiracy theorists, the psychologists who have done this, tend to say that they're people who are attracted to secret knowledge. They're people who distrust institutions. They're people who are, just want to be on the inside. The people who want to take the red pill in the Matrix. This is very popular. Not everybody who wants to take the red pill, of course, but science deniers are always folks who identify themselves as, being the one who really wants to know the truth, which to me shows that they're redeemable because maybe you could convince them if you could get them to listen to the evidence. So you wanted me to say a word about the 5 tropes.
Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so the 5 tropes of science denial reasoning were discovered by Mark and Chris Hufnagel, developed by Stephen Lewandowski, John Cook, other cognitive scientists. They go like this. Every single science denier cherry picks evidence, believes in conspiracy theories, engages in illogical reasoning, relies on fake experts and denigrates real experts. And then my favorite, they insist that science has to be perfect in order to be credible. This sometimes comes out as a claim that scientists have to offer proof. You'll often hear climate deniers say, well, has the definitive experiment been done yet? Can you prove it? Is there 100% consensus? And if there's not, then they say, well, so maybe you're wrong and my view is just as good. But if there's really the best profile of a science denier is, do they subscribe to those five tropes? And they do.
Mm-hmm. Does science denial have anything to do with politics or political motivation or engagement? Because it seems that, I mean, when we look into science denial on the right or the left, I mean, it seems to follow certain trends in terms of people tending to deny science that clashes with their own ideology in this case.
That's exactly the way to put it. And that ideology doesn't have to always be a political ideology. And if it is a political ideology, it doesn't always have to be from the right. An awful lot of science denial these days has come from the right. Climate denial, COVID denial in the United States anyway. These have been politicized, and so those are very strongly associated with a right-wing political ideology. But it is entirely possible for science denial to come from the left or to be non-politicized. There's some areas of science denial, like anti-vax before COVID, was really bipartisan. I mean, you had just as many conservatives as liberals, or I should say liberals as conservatives, who were anti-vaxxers. Now, maybe for different reasons. Maybe the conservative folks were more libertarian and they didn't want government mandates for vaccines. And maybe the people on the left didn't trust big pharma. So maybe, for different reasons. But it was not politicized really until after COVID.
Mm-hmm. So because people nowadays tend to look at our political and social environment through a pessimistic lens, would you say that when it comes to science denial specifically, that it would be worse nowadays than it was before? Before meaning whatever, I mean, whatever time frame you might think about.
Well, this is not, it's the worst that it's been in my lifetime. But of course, science denial was much worse in the long ago past in human history. I was in Rome recently and stood before the statue of Giordano Bruno, who was burned at the stake for believing that that there could be life in other worlds, that the stars were other suns and there might be other planets. So I mean, that's so you just saw a ghost come in, but that's actually my dog. The ghost of Giordano Bruno coming in. I mean, that's a serious consequence for science denial. So I think science denial was worse then, and the consequences were worse. But right now, it's pretty bad. Compare it to the breakthroughs in science in the 1950s and 60s during the heyday of NASA and physics, and everyone was, seemed very pro-science. They may not have understood it, but they were very pro-science. Now that seems to have eroded somewhat, though there's still an awful lot of people who do trust science. But I think that, and another thing going on, it's important to remember, is that the science deniers now, they've always been around, but they're louder now because they've got the internet, they've got a microphone. The guy standing on the corner with the tinfoil hat handing out the mimeograph sheet that said we've never been to the moon, he wasn't getting through to that many people. But now with a website, he can get through to millions.
Yeah, that's completely right. But I mean, do you think it's possible to change the mind of science deniers?
I do. It is possible. It's not easy. And it depends on the science denier. But there's now empirical evidence to show that this is the case. There was a study by Cornelia Bache and Philip Schmid in Nature Human Behavior in 2019, in which they really provided the first empirical evidence to show that you could talk science deniers out of their views. Now, as a philosopher and a methodologist, I was very interested in this study. I mean, I'd been studying science now for a long time, and they provided empirical evidence to show it was possible. So I was very excited by this. But of course, I also wanted to push it because I wondered, their study was done online. So I wondered, what if you approach science deniers face to face, which is how you usually meet them?
Yeah.
At the Thanksgiving table, right, at Christmas. How do you, and could it work with hardcore science deniers? It's one thing to have someone in the lab, say a college freshman, who you're presenting false information and then you immediately debunk it, which is what Bache and Schmidt did. And I'm overjoyed that that worked. But what do you do then about the flat earthers at a convention? What do you do about the anti-vaxxers holding signs saying fire Fauci? They haven't just heard that message once. It didn't just occur to them that morning. They've been marinating in disinformation for years. And so my question was, would this work with hardcore? There's no empirical evidence on that, to my knowledge, but there is great anecdotal evidence to show that this works, that it can work. And in fact, what the anecdotal evidence shows that, there are examples, I can give you examples of science centers who have changed their mind, hardcore people. And it always happens in exactly the same way, which is that they meet someone or they already know someone that they trust, who's patient and respectful and engages them in calm conversation and talks them out of it. And so I went out and tried it. I went out to do this, and my book is called How to Talk to a Science Denier. And I went out on the road to see if a philosopher could convince people to change their mind on denialist beliefs.
Okay, but in this case, would there be any list of strategies to follow to engage with science deniers?
Yes, and if you read the Bache and Schmidt study, they talk about this. There are really two methods. One is what's called content rebuttal. Content rebuttal is when you are, say, an expert on climate change, and the topic is climate change, and someone will say, well, there hasn't been any change in, based on the satellite data, there hasn't been any change in global temperature between 1997 and, whatever the year was.
Yeah.
And, well, no, actually, that is wrong. Those data have been corrected, and let's look at the whole graph. So, if you're a content expert, that can work. The really intriguing thing, though, is that there's another thing called technique rebuttal. And technique rebuttal is when you are able to understand, so those 5 tropes of science denial reasoning I gave you earlier are a blueprint for how science deniers reason, not just the content of their belief, but how they convince themselves. And what they showed in the experiment is that if you understand those 5 steps, you can use those to push back. For example, you could say, well, what you just said to me is based on a conspiracy theory, or show them that it's cherry picking. Even better is to identify the reasoning strategy before they use it. To say something like, now, we're going to have a content about the data on climate change, but I want you to beware of cherry picking, because we have to look at all the evidence. We can't just look at the evidence that supports one fringe hypothesis. That can be effective.
So since we're talking about this, in your book you mention 3 different levels of engagement with science deniers: inoculation, intervention, and overturning beliefs. So could you explain each of those and perhaps tell us if those same strategies of engagement would work in all of them or not?
It's an empirical question whether it would work for all of them. I think that they probably do, and I've tried to test it through anecdotal work, but it remains to be scientifically tested whether they all work at the 3 levels. But the 3 levels are important because science denial exists on a spectrum. Not everyone has been, soaking in the disinformation about science for, 10 years. Some of them are just hearing it for the first time. Good example is COVID. Disinformation gets out there on the internet, and people start to have questions. Now, if they're disrespected, if they're told that they're stupid, or, why would you have such questions, or why don't you let the scientists worry about that? That makes them angry, and maybe they can go a little further down the denialist path. Yeah. And so we have to really be careful, because, if you get to people early, you can inoculate them. And I've got a friend named Andy Norman who's got a book called Mental Immunity, where he argues about this very thing.
Yes, I've had him on the show, by the way.
Oh, okay. So inoculation, I think, getting to them early before they've even been infected with the bad ideas is very good. But what do you do when someone has already been infected with the bad idea? Mm-hmm. Well, then you can intervene. Yeah. Then you can, then your job is a little bit harder. Mm-hmm. But if you approach the person with patience and respect, you build trust, you might be able to talk them out of it. Trust is essential, because science deniers aren't just fed false facts. They're fed a message that they shouldn't trust people. Right. Who are scientists or who are allies of scientists giving them the other side, right? This science denial is based usually on disinformation, somebody purposely giving them false information. And so that's why you can't convince them with facts, because without trust, who's going to listen to your facts? So intervention is the way to go there. And the Bates and Schmid study is a study in intervention. It's a study in debunking, as opposed to pre-bunking, inoculation, to debunking somebody once they've already been infected with false beliefs. Mm-hmm. The hardest one of all is overturning. This is when you get somebody who is extremely hardcore, someone who is not just attending a flat Earth convention, but somebody who's speaking at a flat Earth convention, somebody who is got 2 million subscribers, to their YouTube account, and they're, presenting all of the reasons why you can't trust the CDC. They're the very hardest to overturn. But again, even they sometimes give up their beliefs. It's much harder to do. And as a philosopher, I like the challenge of, trying to do that. But I can give you examples of absolutely hardcore deniers who have given up their beliefs, whose beliefs have been overturned with exactly this same methodology I'm talking about. The Bates and Schmid study didn't talk about attitudes, trust, respect, calm, listening, but that's something that I didn't invent that methodology, but I'd been reading about it in Michael Shermer's article in Scientific American. And then you notice that this is the recommendation in deprogramming people from cults. There's literature on using this methodology to talk people out of political extremist beliefs. Psychologists use it in motivational interviewing, or active listening, it's sometimes called. Street epistemology uses it. Mm-hmm. So there are great, there's great reason to think that this could be shown empirically. Just to my knowledge, it hasn't been done yet.
Mm-hmm. So, before we go on to talking about other aspects of science denial, give us then, please, some examples of, I think let's go to the hardcore ones. Hardcore science deniers who have been overturned, let's say.
Okay. So my favorite example, and I talk about many examples in my book, but I'll give you my favorite example. There was a U.S. congressman a few years back, Jim Bridenstine, mm-hmm. who was a very rock-ribbed, solid conservative. And he gave a speech on the floor of the U.S. House in which he argued that climate change was a hoax. anthropogenic climate change was not real. The scientists were biased. They were, giving false information. You couldn't trust them. All the things that science deniers say. Very hardcore. This was part of his identity. Mm-hmm. So, of course, Donald Trump appointed him to be head of NASA. Yeah. Because what else would you do with a guy like that but make him the head of maybe the world's premier climate research organization, NASA? But very interesting thing happened with Jim Bridenstine, because a few months, I think it was maybe actually only a few weeks, but it was not that long that he was at NASA, that he completely changed his mind, gave another speech in which he said that climate change was real, we were causing it, and we needed to do something about it. Now, that's a hardcore person who came out publicly and said, I was wrong. And the question is, how did that happen?
Yeah.
When they talked to Bridenstine, he said, well, he read a lot. Well, okay. He had been reading a lot about this before, maybe reading the wrong things. I think there's a better explanation, a more plausible explanation. As head of NASA, he was all of a sudden surrounded by some of the world's greatest scientists, mm-hmm. who he got to know personally. They were no longer just the faceless other that somebody was telling him to distrust because they were evil, biased, corrupt people. They were, Bill and Natalie, the people that he supervised. He was their boss. He was hanging out with them. He was having lunch with them. He was meeting with them. They're trustworthy, warm, wonderful people. And they changed his mind just through this methodology I'm talking about: patience, mm-hmm. respect, trust. They built trust with him and changed his mind.
Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting that you brought up that example, because then that makes a good bridge to the question I wanted to ask you. That is, don't you think there's also a very big social aspect of science denial? And I mean, when you said that, for example, in this case, him being surrounded by trustful scientists, I mean, basically being put into a new community of people who probably all of them believed in climate yes. change. I mean, don't you think that also makes a yes. big difference? Because some of these beliefs that science deniers express, sometimes they get social benefits from them if they are using them to signal their belonging and commitment to a particular social yes. group, for example.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Science denial beliefs are often based on identity, not on actual evidence. And there is, of course, a social aspect to belief. Jim Bridenstine's social group before that was Republicans in Congress. His social group later was scientists at NASA. You change his social group, he changed his beliefs. That's maybe not surprising. What's really interesting is that there is empirical evidence to show that beliefs are social. Mm-hmm. All beliefs, even factual beliefs, can be social. Influenced by social. Famous experiment by Solomon Asch way back in 1955, 53, I think it was 55, where he took a bunch of students, I think it was 10 or 20 students, I think it was maybe 10, and he put them in a group, and he knew 9 of the students. They were the Confederates. There was only one experimental subject. You probably know this experiment. And he gave them lines on a chalkboard. Which line is longer, this one or this one? Yeah. And he had told the Confederates the first couple of rounds, do it correctly. And the 10th person gave the correct answer. But after a while, after they got to the designated predetermined point, one after the other 9 started to say that the shorter line was longer. In 33% of the cases, the 10th person said it was as well. Uh-huh. Social influence on which line is longer when, it was not even close which line was longer, but the person went along in their beliefs with their social group. I think that's very important. And it's why it's so hard to change a science denier's mind, because in a way you're changing their identity.
Yeah.
There's this big interesting question of why we would have that built into us. Wouldn't trust be selected for by the evolutionary environment? I mean, what's the evolutionary advantage of saying, well, yeah, that could be a tiger, but it's probably not because everybody else thinks it's not. Your genes are going to get taken out of the pool, right? Just right then. Why would those genes get passed on? Interesting hypotheses these days from Mercier and Sperber to argue that what's really selected for is agreeableness, ability to be persuasive, to get along with other people in your tribal group, so that that's what gets your genes into the next generation. So some of these cognitive biases that we think of as so horrible, they actually have an evolutionary advantage. That's why they're built in. They're selected for something, otherwise they would have been selected out. So you're dead on, exactly right. Social aspect to belief, identity, this is part and parcel of science denial.
And I mean, talking about the evolutionary aspect of that, isn't it also the case that, I mean, not always probably, but in many of the cases of science denial, we are talking about things which we haven't been exposed to during our evolutionary history, like vaccines, for example, or even things that, I mean, believing it one way or the other doesn't really make any difference for people's practical daily lives. Like, for example, flat Earth or something. I mean, it doesn't change anything in people's day-to-day lives if the Earth is
That's
flat
right.
or not. So,
That's right. I mean, in your day-to-day experience, you look out and you think the world is flat and it's not moving.
yeah,
But because you've studied in school and you
yeah,
trust
sure.
scientists, and why would they fake all those pictures and the moon landing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, that's how science works, right? You build up warrant and likelihood and the belief on the basis of your trust of the process by which the beliefs were discovered. So, so yes, I mean, and there are certain things. I mean, we could get off on the dogleg on the evolutionary question, but there are certain things that are probably built into us, like disgust. You're not going to pick up a piece of food that's been sitting there for 3 days. You don't know where it came from. You've got an evolutionary reason to be wired in not to do that. But
Yes.
do you have an evolutionary wired in reason to think that a vaccine is going to prevent a disease? No, you have to be convinced of that. You have to be educated about what diseases and what vaccines do and how they work. And so maybe our intuition tells us, well, I don't know. And if everybody in my social group is questioning it and telling me they're dangerous, maybe I should investigate. Well, then the big problem is people go to the internet, which is completely polluted information source. They start to look for, they maybe Google, are vaccines safe? And the first several hits that they get are YouTube videos arguing that they're not. What are they going to believe?
But going back for a second to the social aspect of science denial, do you think that there's anything that could be done about that? Because it seems very hard
Yes.
to change it.
Enlarge their social group. This is why it's such a tragedy that we're not talking to one another anymore. The way that you change people's hardcore extremist beliefs is to enlarge their community, to get them to talk to and trust people who believe other things. When they're in an information silo, either a community or on TV or the internet, whatever group they're in that's reinforcing their false beliefs, we need to try to enlarge that. One way we enlarge that is by the allies of science need to begin to talk to people who don't believe in science or who don't believe in particular aspects of science, particular like vaccines. And then maybe they learn, well, wait a minute, you're not a monster. You're in fact kind of a nice person, and maybe I should trust you. They change their beliefs. I can give you a lot of interesting examples of this outside science. There's a famous case of an African American blues musician named Daryl Davis, who talks people out of the Ku Klux Klan by befriending them. Maybe they've never had a friend who was black before, but he, by remaining calm, by not shouting at them, by engaging them in conversation, letting them get to know him, he has talked 200 people out of the Ku Klux Klan. They give him their robes as a sign that they've converted. So, I mean, that is an amazing thing.
Mm-hmm.
If he can do that, why can't we talk people out of their vaccine, anti-vax beliefs? I think that we need to, sometimes those beliefs are pretty deep, but another thing that happens is it's easy to give up. It's easy to say, you know what, I can't even talk to them anymore, to dismiss them, to say, they're not worth talking to. They are worth talking to. Because if you cut them off, the only people left in their social group are people who believe exactly what they believe.
Mm-hmm. So, talking about strategies and methods to counter science denial, do you think that just teaching how science works could help in any way?
Well, it certainly couldn't hurt. I mean, a good deal of the flaw in science denial reasoning is because they don't understand how science works. Insisting on proof shows that they don't really understand about confidence intervals and an error bar or induction. I mean, they don't understand how science works. Mm-hmm. Highlighting how scientists find what they find, I think could convince some people not to be science deniers, especially if we start when they're kids. So often science is taught as science appreciation. Look at all these geniuses and what they discovered, and they've discovered the truth, so let's find what they found. They don't tell you that in 20 years, some of what they're teaching you is going to change. Yeah. They don't tell you all the false ideas that were discarded and all the people who resisted the discovery. But they should. I think they also need to teach history of science to show just how difficult science is. And for adults too, not just for kids. I mean, one of my goals is to teach science deniers how science actually works. I think that could help. And you know what? When they say, "Oh, I'm not a science denier, I'm a scientist. I'm better than the scientist because I'm more skeptical," I'll say, "Great. So you believe in evidence? Yes. You believe in truth? Yes. Let's have a conversation then about how we should form our beliefs based on evidence. Would you do experiments? Yes. Okay. Now it's important to have a way to check whether the experiment is true. So we better have some other people checking our data, right? Yes. Well, that's called peer review. You can use that as an opportunity."
Mm-hmm. So, talking about the scientific method, what if we're dealing with a more kind of sophisticated science denier, like, for example, a philosopher who simply rejects the scientific method or the epistemology of science?
Mm-hmm. Some of the most virulent science deniers are people with a little bit of education in science, because they know exactly how to cherry pick just the right study. They know the literature. But the important thing, I think, then is to use technique rebuttal, to talk about how they're reasoning. Sometimes the gadfly is right. Galileo was right, but he had the evidence. So the important thing is, if, say, you're talking to another scientist, to lean very heavily on, well, you say that your hypothesis is correct, but where's your evidence? And has it been peer reviewed? And have you been able to get anybody else to take this seriously? And if not, why not? I mean, you do occasionally find scientists who are climate deniers. Now you have to ask, what kind of scientist are they? Are they climatologists? Is this their area of specialty? There are a few that I can name who are specialists, whose views are contrarian. But this is always the case. This is the case for evolution. This was the case for hand washing, back 150 years ago for the germ theory of disease. I mean, this is always the case. And the flaw in the science denier reasoning is to think that you need 100% consensus for, to have warrant to believe that something is true. So often if you push, the medical doctors who are against vaccines, push them, and you'll find that maybe they have an alternative cure to sell, or that they're not quite a specialist in that area, or that the hypothesis they're putting forward is one that's not borne out by the evidence, or that other scientists don't take it seriously. This happens sometimes. Great example is Andrew Wakefield, who was an MD, who did this study that allegedly showed that the MMR vaccine caused autism. But then when you investigate it, you find that there were methodological flaws in the study. You investigate further, you find that the data were fraudulent. He cheated, he made it up. So there, he was still an MD, but he's been stripped of his medical license. The study was retracted. Should we take that seriously? I don't think so.
Mm-hmm. So what about the fact that probably most science is counterintuitive, and particularly from an evolutionary perspective, we have not really evolved to process this kind of information or to approach the world with this sort of epistemology of science in mind? I mean, doesn't that render it harder for people to accept science, particularly if they're not been exposed and convinced of the reliability of the scientific method?
It's one of the most amazing things about science to me, that scientists are willing to say, if I think my hypothesis is true, then you would find this particular evidence. And if you don't find the evidence, then there's something wrong with the hypothesis. You go back and revise it. So people who want to evaluate the truth of scientific hypotheses based on their own intuition are doing it wrong. It's not based on your intuition. I mean, you can come up with a scientific hypothesis through intuition or anything you want, but the way that you determine whether it's true or not is through testing. And the ability to say, my instinct might be wrong, so I better test this. It's kind of like a pilot flying with instruments. Your visual tells you that you're upright, but your instruments tell you that you're upside down. So guess what you trust? Your instruments, right? Otherwise you're going to crash the plane, right? So, and I mean, you've mentioned the term scientific method a couple of times. I don't think there is a scientific method. Most philosophers of science don't, because the scientific method sounds like a recipe for growing science. You observe, you hypothesize, you draw a prediction, you test the prediction. If it's wrong, you go back. Now, I just used a little piece of that, talking about hypothesis leading to a prediction. So, I mean, all of those things are things that scientists do. It's just that when you put it in a package, scientific method, it makes it sound like you start with observation at one end and you get truth at the other. And Karl Popper famously, I think, even wrote a paper called Why There Is No Scientific Method. And in an earlier book of mine, The Scientific Attitude, I argue that what's really special about science is not its methodology, it's the attitude that scientists have of being willing to say that they believe in evidence so strongly that they're willing to change their mind if new evidence comes forward to suggest that they're wrong. So it's that attitude of being humble in the face of the evidence. So when you say that people don't believe in scientific method, we'll have to clarify what that means, because, do you mean by that they're not willing to change their beliefs based on the evidence or something else?
Yeah, I was basically referring to that. I mean, yes, I've already had some discussions precisely about
Right.
what you were
Right.
just
We
referring
did
to.
talk
I
about
mean,
that.
we did
Yeah.
talk before, and I had Massimo Piliucci on the show also,
Yes.
for example, and we
Yeah.
talked about the demarcation problem and all of that.
Yes.
And I mean, different approaches in different areas of science. So yeah, I mean, I used
Okay.
the term scientific method just as a shorthand
I
for.
understand. And most people use it. I have a I think that to the layperson, when they think of scientific method, I think that it feeds into the idea of certainty and proof. And I want to get away from that. I want to make sure that people understand that it's a strength of science that it has uncertainty to the extent that it uses new evidence to change their mind. That's an important aspect of science. So I want to emphasize that.
Sure. So, but do you think that, particularly when people do not have enough information at their disposal, that sometimes, even if it's not true, it could be rational for people to deny science?
You raise a really important question because there are some areas in which there's not enough evidence. And when there's not enough evidence, then there are alternative hypotheses. And how do you decide between those hypotheses you continue to test? But this can go on for years. I mean, and so it's a much dicier thing to call somebody a science denier in an environment like that, because maybe what they're doing is just questioning the scientific consensus, and sometimes the scientific consensus is wrong. I mean, this is what science deniers always do. They want to cloak themselves in, well, I'm the next Galileo. I'm the next Wegener. You know, I'm the one who's going to take on the entire consensus of science and show that they're wrong. Well, that's fine, but speculation is one thing, evidence is another. So, you know, if it were actually an open scientific question, whether the earth was flat or not, then, and we didn't have any way to measure it. There were, you know, data. We didn't have any way to figure that out. Then it would be a dicier thing. But because we do have evidence, because there are experiments that we can do, that's when people are called deniers, which means that really if they're a scientist that they get read out of the profession. It means that they're not willing to change their mind on the basis of new evidence. And as I said in my earlier book, that's when they give up the scientific attitude. They're no longer scientists. They're not living or dying by the evidence. But your point is really a great one. When the evidence underdetermine the theory, what should you do? And then now to make it one step worse, as a philosopher, I can always make it worse. There are some arguments that you can take seriously in philosophy, which argue that the theory is always underdetermined by the evidence, that there are always alternative theories. And that's a very serious, important argument. But what it does not sanction is the idea that the theory with less evidence is more likely to be true, or that the theory that's been refuted is more likely to be true. And this is where science deniers often find themselves. Scientists will sometimes find themselves where the data are equivocal and they can't tell between two or more theories. That's fine. But when the evidence comes in and it knocks one of those theories down, that gives it less warrant. It's less believable. It still might be right, but it's a much heavier lift. And this is what the science deniers never seem to understand. They need more evidence to show that they're right, and they don't produce it.
So earlier, for example, you mentioned that there are science deniers who are also conspiracy theorists and others who
Yes.
aren't really. So, I mean, can we talk about different kinds of science denier, or is
Sure.
that not really a thing?
Well, they're all conspiracy theorists. Um, but there are different types of science deniers because there are different topics on which they're deniers. Um, there's evolution denial. There's GMO denial. There's flat Earth. There's anti-vax before COVID. There's anti-vax since COVID. There's climate denial. There are many other examples, and I go into several of them in the book. Those are the major areas of science denial. And the interesting thing is that the folks who embrace those, sometimes they choose one, but they don't choose another. Maybe they're a climate denier, but they're not anti-vax. Maybe they're a flat earther, but they believe in climate change. I mean, you find that sometimes. So, they're what I call cafeteria skeptics. Hey, you go through a cafeteria, I'll have a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but I'll leave that there. They're picking and choosing the areas of science that they're going to believe, and they're not believing the rest of them. Very few people are anti-science. They don't like anything. They don't believe anything that science comes up with. But quite a number of people are cafeteria skeptics. They say, well, I think that the data for that show that the drug from Regeneron, the monoclonal antibodies, are a very good treatment. Somebody's a vaccine denier, they won't get a vaccine, but then they get sick and they go to the hospital, give me the monoclonal antibodies. Oh, they trust that. They just didn't trust the vaccine. They're being selective.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we've already talked a little bit about the strategies we can use to engage with science deniers and perhaps try to turn their minds around. I mean, I would imagine that because there's still not much science done on this topic, that we can't, at this point, we can't really be sure about the long-term effects of these strategies, right?
There's some data which show that people who change their mind will sometimes change it back. So it's kind of like you've got a warm cup of tea, you leave it sit, it'll grow cold, right? You've got to continue to keep it warm. And that's how it can work with science deniers too, right? You can't go into the conversation expecting to change their mind on the spot and then walk away and then it will hold. So, I mean, there are some, I can't quote you the names of the studies, but there are studies which show that when people change their minds, without reinforcement, they will sometimes change it back. And I'm talking about on empirical topics, not values topics, though that happens too, but on empirical topics. Why? Because maybe they're back in their community now. I mean, why do people change their mind about anything? So to tell you the truth, I think that the main impediment is that people don't want to believe that there's anything that they can do. Because, and that's a shocking thing for me to say, but I'm out there trying to change minds, not just of the science deniers, but of the people who believe in science, to believe that they can do something about this. And sometimes I get resistance from them. And I'll say, but you're being a science denier. And they say, what do you mean? And I say, Bates and Schmidt showed in Nature, for God's sakes, one of the premier scientific journals, is an article showing that you can use these techniques to convince science deniers. But now you're telling me that you don't think that that's right? No, that's right. Well, then why aren't you out there using it, right? So, I mean, I suppose there's a difference between believing something and acting on the belief. But I'm trying to convince scientists and allies of science to engage, to get out there and do it. Now, it's uncomfortable to do. Maybe they'd rather just stay in their lab and do their work. But it is really important, I think, to talk to people, because if you don't, science denial gets worse. COVID is a perfect example of that, right? You can't just do a public service ad that says, this is what you should do, and expect that, well, I mean, we're scientists, we have PhDs, you should do what we say. No, it doesn't work that way. They have to trust you, and in order to trust you, they have to meet you. I think one of the best things that scientists could do is have business cards made up and hand them out to the people they meet at the school board meetings, or to friends, so that, and hand them to other people that they don't know, so that people get to know a scientist. Because if you get to know a scientist, then you've got somebody you can ask a question to. They're part of your social group. They're more trustworthy. People don't want to do that. Now, I understand why. Because in this political environment, they get yelled at, they get disrespected. Sometimes they get physical threats against them. Who wants that? But this is why I personally demonstrated in my own life that you can do this. I went to a flat earth convention where there were 650 flat earthers, and they knew who I was. I spoke with them. It was uncomfortable. And I didn't change anybody's mind that I know of, but I got them to listen. They were pretty hardcore, but I got them to listen. I listened to them and they listened to me. And we had dozens and dozens of respectful conversations in which I at least get credit for showing up. And I think they began to trust me. They began to ask me questions about my beliefs. And I think that if more people did that, we would take a bite out of the problem. It's not the entire solution to the problem, but it's an important part for the people who have already been infected with false belief.
Mm-hmm. So I would just like to ask you, and also to sum things up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if someone is confronted with a science denier and they would like to try to do something about it, I mean, where should they start, and where should they go? And I mean, I don't know if you want to just tell us about the strategies again in a specific order, or if you want to illustrate things with a personal example you might have or not.
The best possible thing you can do is ask them questions about their beliefs. Not just what they believe, but why they believe it. If you're curious about their beliefs and you get them to talk, they will eventually tell you things that you can follow up on, that you can then ask more questions. Well, why do you believe that? Say somebody thinks that there is a biometric, a microchip that has had biometric, tracking data in their vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
You might say, why do you believe that? And they say, well, it was all over the internet. Didn't you read it? Yeah, I did read it. Well, but aren't you worried about that? I mean, so many people believe it. Maybe there's got to be something to it. And then I might say, but it might not be true. I mean, doesn't that sound really implausible to you? Well, yes, I suppose it sounds implausible, but until you've proven to me that it's not true, I'm not going to get my vaccine. And then I might say something like, well, but look, it sounds like you're saying that if I can't prove to you that it's not true in an empirical study, but what if I could show you that where that study began, where that story began, was based on a propaganda campaign by a foreign government to try to undermine American trust in science? They say, really? Yeah. Didn't you read these stories? No. And then I'll tell them about the Russian disinformation campaign that started in one of Putin's troll farms to publish a story in April 2020 in the Oriental Review, which is an English language Russian-controlled propaganda arm, which had this story in it. 2-3 weeks after we had COVID lockdown, this story was already out there. There weren't even any vaccines yet. Bottom of the story, please share on Twitter, please share on Facebook, which a lot of people did. By the following month, 44% of Republican voters in the United States thought that there was something to this. That's how disinformation spreads. So what I've done there is taken the person who wouldn't get their COVID vaccine because they thought that there might be microchips and given them, I planted the seed of doubt. I've given them reason to be skeptical about whether that's true. Now, might it still be true? You know, what do they say? You can't prove a negative, right? I think you could come pretty damn close. But what I've done there is given them, in fact, to somebody who already believes in conspiracy theories, reason to understand, to become suspicious about how that story got its way into the information mainstream. What I just told you, by the way, is true. How many people know that? Not very many. That story has not been publicized very much. Wall Street Journal had a series on this, disappeared. Nobody's talking about it anymore. The New York Times had an article called Putin's Long War Against American Science. Wonderful article talking about Putin's Russia engaging in science denial on GMOs, on climate change, on 5G, on vaccines for decades before COVID even came around. What many people don't understand is that science denial is not a mistake, it's a lie. It's for the most part, it's based on disinformation, not misinformation, disinformation that's created by someone for a malicious purpose. And then it gets on the internet and it takes off. So if you can talk to science deniers to let them begin to understand that, you might have a chance of convincing them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's end on that note then. The book is again How to Talk to a Science Denier, Conversations with Flat Earthers, Climate Deniers and Others Who Defy Reason. I will be leaving a link to it in the description box of the interview. Dr. McIntyre, would you like to mention places on the internet where people can find your work?
The best possible place to find my work is at my website, leemcintyrebooks.com. There are links for all my books, my speeches, radio, TV, anything that I've done, upcoming speeches. It's all there together. And I can't believe we're out of time already. What a wonderful set of questions and a great conversation. Thank you again so much.
Well, thank you for coming on the show again. And as I said, it's always a pleasure to have you on. So I hope to have you again somewhere in the future.
I'll have to write another book.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. Please also consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. All of the links are in the description of the interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litske and Blanchett, Perega Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Bernardo Seixas, Paulo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Robert Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litzke, Denise Cook, Scott, and Zachary Fish. My producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Tafinia, Kian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.